but they were all terrified. And you wouldn't know whether to believe it or not. And of course, if you believed any of it, you'd be just...
Well, we'll get started, Miss Plunkett.
Yes.
In my conversations with you, you have mentioned that you find it a bit difficult to tell specific anecdotes about Joe. I suppose this is because you were so close to him, you were his sister. But
Yes.
now, in the case of, let's say, Thomas MacDonagh,
Yes.
it's perhaps different. There was a definite point when he came into your life.
Yes.
Now, could we start there? Could you tell me about Thomas MacDonagh, how you came to know him first, and what impressions he made on you?
Well, my first impression about him was what my sister Moya told me, that Joe had a new teacher. Joe was supposed to be studying for matric. And this man was teaching him various things. Mathematics, for instance. And he'd also taught Moya, my sister, mathematics. And the two of them together learnt from Thomas MacDonagh, who was such a good teacher that in about 2 hours he managed to get into their heads the whole idea of all the books of Euclid, which my sister Moya said she had never properly understood before, that it was all a muddle in her head. And that in about 2 hours he got the whole principle of it into their heads, so that they couldn't forget it.
How did Thomas MacDonagh fit into your family background?
When I came home from school, he was already an old friend in the house, and everybody accepted him as such. And he had a great social talent, and got on well with everybody as far as I could see.
Do you think that he was inclined perhaps to push himself a little too much in conversation, to over-entertain the company?
I don't think so. I think he was a very modest kind of man. But he was very polite and sociable. And he was also grateful for hospitality, because that was before he was married, and he had no home of his own much, I think. I don't know exactly.
Well, let's come to your brother now for a moment, Miss Plunkett. I think you feel that your brother has become a legendary figure. Now, how would you go about, let's say, reducing him to flesh and blood?
Well, it has been such a determined effort to make him a legendary figure, and it has gone on for so long. It started, as far as I can make out, immediately after the Rising. That is rather difficult. But other people have become legendary figures too. Pearse, but then Pearse wrote an awful lot, so I suppose people couldn't help knowing a good deal more about him.
Well, one of the ways where we can, let's say, show Joe Plunkett as a figure, an ordinary man, is to put him in his family background. Now, this is where you can really tell us things. I know you may be somewhat reticent to talk about family relationships, but...
Not at all.
Okay. Well, let's talk about, let's say, Joe's relations with his mother.
Well, not a bad word, well, isn't it? The sun rose and set in him, in her estimation. But people don't always behave extremely well towards those they love. And of course they have their differences of opinion. I do remember a good few arguments, yes. I suppose there were many opposing points of view in the house. But everybody in the house adored Joe. I don't like the idea of him being called Joseph Mary Plunkett. He was never called that in his lifetime by anybody. That started immediately after his death. And people to this day, speaking to me about him, call him Joseph Mary Plunkett with great formality, forgetting that he was my brother and that I didn't call him Joseph Mary Plunkett. Nobody called him that.
Miss Plunkett,
was alive.
you'll forgive me for pursuing this line.
Certainly.
You said that there were arguments in the house. Did you have arguments with his mother?
Yes, of course he had.
Over what?
Over anything, I can't remember. Sometimes over money, I suppose. Because he, being an invalid, wasn't able to make very much. I don't think he was ever paid much for anything he wrote. But then, when he was editing the Irish Review, after all, that was an undertaking that my mother had to take responsibility for.
Did his arguments, let's say, with his mother ever work him up to such a state that he gave vent to his feelings in verse?
Yes, once that I remember.
Could you tell us about that?
No, I don't like to.
All right.
That was somebody letting off steam. And after all, when you've let off the steam, you don't exactly want to pursue it.
Well, what about Joe and his father? Were they very close?
Yes, especially at the end.
Could we talk more on that line? How did the news of Joe's death affect your parents?
My father had been sent to get in touch with Germany on Joe's instructions. And he went to Switzerland with messages from Joe and from the volunteers. Describe it any way you like. They were presumably more than from Joe, these orders. But I suppose he was directly under Joe's orders when he went to Switzerland to get in touch with Germany. So, of course, he knew the risks. My mother wasn't so conscious of it. She had been on a lecture tour in America and had only come back after 6 months there, shortly before the Rising. And of course, when she saw us all apparently making preparations for war, she looked at us and laughed as if we had 10 heads. She couldn't make it out at all. Yet she had some idea before she went to America that something was coming off. But when, you see, it might strike you that it would take years to prepare.
But how did the news then of his death affect your parents?
Well, what do you think? They were both in prison. We were searching for them. My sister Jerry and I were searching for my father and mother. So I wasn't with my mother at the time that Joe was executed. And we only found my father in Richmond Barracks after efforts all over the place. We got word from my mother that she was in Mountjoy. And when she got into Mountjoy from Kilmainham, she thought she was in heaven. Kilmainham was such a frightful place to be in. So she was going through a bit of what Joe was suffering and what the others were suffering. So I suppose that was some consolation. But of course my father was in bits when Jerry and I found him in Richmond jail. He was sunk very low. But he had seen Joe, which was a great thing. He looked out his cell window and Joe looked out his cell window and they were close to each other. So they looked at each other for half an hour. Of course, everybody expected death, and my father expected death for himself and for Joe and for everybody. Perhaps even for his wife.
Could I leave this point for a moment, Miss Plunkett? We'll return to it. I want to talk about Joe's spirituality. Now, this is a quality which perhaps more than any other quality is very often stressed. Now, I quote from a recent
Quite rightly.
pamphlet.
Yes.
For instance, here it said, above all things else, Joseph Mary Plunkett was a man of spirit, a man of vision. Now, how far were you aware that he was let's say, a man of spirit and a man of vision?
Very strongly aware of that. The whole family was. They couldn't help knowing it. As a priest described it, sometime after his death, he had a mind lovingly fixed on God. And he was always facing death from the time he was 10 years old. So that was a very good reason, wasn't it?
He was a very sick man.
He was a very sick man off and on.
How did he bear up under illness?
Extremely well. There were times when we didn't see him. Joe was in hospital again, or having an operation, which meant cutting a piece off his neck. That was the peculiar way of doing it then. And of course he was in hospital immediately before the Rising too.
How did he occupy himself when he was ill? Did he have any... You were telling me once that when he was ill, and I think it was Fitzwilliam Street.
He was painting a picture on the wall, yes. He occupied himself with everything as far as I can make out. He occupied himself. Of course, when he was better, sometimes he would disappear for 3 days and he'd be locked into his room and nobody'd go near him. And that wouldn't mean he was sick. Everybody knew that that was Joe writing a poem.
He was a man of, let's say, many interests.
Yes.
Now, let's talk about a few of these, perhaps photography.
Yes, he was a very keen photographer all his life, as far as I remember. But of course, I often remember being made a model for this photography, and that everybody was made a model. And I believe he was the first to work with Lumiere plates, the first in Ireland. I remember him doing colour photography and taking photographs of a big picture that my father owned, which was supposed to be a Rubens. He made very successful plates of that. And what happened to the other Lumiere plates, there must have been others of scenery. I only remember just one when we were on a holiday in Achill.
Would you say that Joe was very fond of soldiers, interested in war, that kind of thing?
Of course, when the volunteers started, he acquired that interest. He did everything he could to study strategy and tactics. And that was why a whole room was filled with war games all over the floor, with him and my other two brothers working at it, and some of our friends who were volunteers.
Did he have a particular interest in keeping himself physically fit?
Yes, he had. When he was able to, he did a lot of physical jerks. He worked with things to make him muscular. He was very keen on skating, dancing, all sorts of things.
Now, Miss
He
Plunkett,
tried to have himself physically
I suppose
fit.
the event in your brother's life which really caught the popular fancy was his marriage to Grace Gifford in prison shortly before he was executed.
Yes,
Now, you saw Grace Gifford shortly after this.
yes.
Did she speak about this event?
Of course she did.
What did she say? Was she excited about it? Was she depressed?
She was worked up. She said that the first time she went in to see Joe, she was in there twice that night, that he was in great form. And that when she saw him again, he was very depressed. And it was from that second interview that she did the portrait of him that is in the front of his poems. Her gift was caricature, so it was in the style of a caricature, and it was the best likeness she could make of him. But perhaps it wasn't a very good likeness. Of course, she was buoyed up by the whole affair, and so was everybody else. You see, her mother might have thrown her out, and so that was a very good reason to get married then. And she had become a Catholic not so long before, and I was her godmother. And her mother was very keenly against that, very keenly anti-Catholic, and a very strong character. So that was a very strong reason for us to have the right to look after her. So it was a very strong reason for the marriage, which was to have taken place anyhow on Easter Sunday.
Did Grace think that Joe would not be shot?
Oh, I think she was quite certain he'd be shot. Nobody had any hope of anything else. But when she came in to tell us about the marriage, well, of course she knew that he was to be shot. But the next morning, news was put in the paper that he had got 3 years penal servitude. And she said, I can still hope. But we said, oh, Grace, don't hope. There's nothing to hope for. That can't be true. And Jerry wept and said, Joe couldn't go through 3 years penal servitude. Penal servitude was penal servitude then, and very tough. So it was better for him to die. And I don't think we had any real hope that there'd be anything else. We thought we'd all be executed, more or less. My father was for it, but they didn't know anything about the journey to Switzerland at the time, or he certainly would have been for it.
And when Joe was executed, did you all go into mourning?
No. And Grace asked me, should she wear black? And I said, well, Grace, Jerry and I are not going to wear black. And so Grace didn't wear black. But I suppose we should have consulted other people, older and wiser than us, who are widows. But I have no recollection of widows wearing black at the time.
Well, why did you actually decide not to wear black?
Because it was a triumph that the rising had come off. People made a mockery of the volunteers, some of them did, and said, oh, they're only playing soldiers. These people don't mean anything. They're all going out all dressed up. And indeed a friend of mine who was on the other side that I'd been at school with said, oh, they were dressed up in paper uniforms. Maybe it was some children she saw. I don't know who they were. But she was greatly astonished and really charmed, even though she had been on the other side, when there was a rising, and she apologised for her point of view. So, of course, people felt it was a triumph and that there was to be no mourning.
Could I go back a little? When Joe announced the news of his engagement to Grace Gifford, was it something of a bombshell to the family?
Yes, it was. Everybody was a bit surprised at that.
Could you tell us the occasion?
Well, we were sitting around reading in Larkfield and talking and so on. My father was there, my sister Mimi was there, I was there, my 2 other brothers were there. I suppose Jerry was there, but I can't remember that part of it. And Joe strode into the room in great humour and said, I'm going to marry Grace Gifford. So this was, of course, a bombshell. And nobody had known that they took that much interest in each other. So my father was very solemn, and everybody else was very dumbfounded. And when my father was solemn over the fact that Joe was a sick man, but Joe told my father that he was all right, that he was cured, or words to that effect, that he was much better. So my father had nothing to say then. He was very pleased. And my mother was away in America and had not come home.
Could we talk a little now, Miss Plunkett, about Pierce? You also knew Pierce, didn't you?
Yes, I knew him coming into the house in Larkfield. But he came just to see Joe. I often saw him. He was a very serious man. I also saw his brother Willie quite a lot. And I suppose I spoke to Pierce, and that Joe would be waiting impatiently to have a conversation with him in private. With Pádraig Pierce.
How did Pierce, let's say, compare with somebody else you knew, MacDermott?
Well, I didn't know MacDermott that well, but he was a much more sociable man, less serious on the outside. He appeared less serious. I suppose he was just as serious as Pádraig Pierce. He must have been to have done so much and to have ridden a bicycle when he was, we thought, practically a cripple. But he was a gayer sort of type than Pádraig Pierce. I saw Pierce, I listened to him delivering a lecture on poetry, and it was a most inspiring lecture. You would get to know him a bit better from that than when he'd be just coming into your house talking to have conversations with somebody else, and you felt you had to get out of the way. Immediately let him in.
Sean MacDermott. It was said, wasn't it, that all the girls fell in love with Sean MacDermott?
Well, lots of them did, and they said he gave them plenty of encouragement.
You also knew Tom Clark, didn't you, from
Yes.
going into his shop?
Going into his shop and meeting him in Larkfield and seeing him along the street. And he was, of course, the carrier of the Fenian tradition in our mind. And we also thought of him as older than he was. Of course, he'd been in prison a lot.
Could I take you up on something there? You said seeing him along the street. Could you describe Tom Clark coming down the street to me?
I was walking along O'Connell Street one day towards Bridgman's shop, which was his shop. Was his name over the door? I can't really answer you that. But we called it Bridgman's afterwards, because Bridgman's name was certainly over the door afterwards in 1922. Well, he walked along with his eyes on the ground, rather. But when you spoke to him and he saw you, he put his head up and smiled, and he appeared to be a young man then, this man that I then thought of as an old man. But that's all I can remember about him, except having seen him very often.
Did he ever visit you at home?
I think he must have visited Joe in Larkfield in Kimmage.
To producer, any questions, please? No. No, you can wind it up. No, I don't think so. Ms. Plunkett, thank you very much.
Well, I don't know whether that was what you wanted.
Oh, yes. Yes, certainly. That was fine.
I got very hoarse. spite of the oranges.
Wasn't such an ordeal, was it?
Oh, it wasn't an ordeal, but I felt I was awfully slow.